Collaborative Research Institute in Theoretical Computer Science, and as well as our semester programs, we run these summer clusters. Welcome to the workshop for the Interpretable Machine Learning cluster, Interpretable Machine Learning in the Natural and Social Sciences. Let me start with a big thank you to the organizers of this workshop, Shai, Ben David, Zach Lipton, Ruth Turner, and Bin Yu. Thanks to those folks. It'll be a really exciting week. I'm going to hand over to, I guess, Bin to introduce the workshop in a moment. Just a few things about logistics. The food is outside. Please don't bring food and drinks into the auditorium. For lunches, the food, I guess I should say for breaks. Lunches, you're on your own. So follow a local. There are plenty of options. Masks inside are strongly recommended. Outside, they're optional, of course. At lunchtime, if you need to leave bags, there are lockers on the far side of the building on this level with a PIN code, so you can use those. And we're doing things in a hybrid format on Zoom. Omid is our videographer, so he'll be helping speakers connect computers and microphones and so on. And the other thing to do is thank Kailani Penland at the back here, our events coordinator, for all of the local arrangements. So a big thank you to Kailani. All right, Ben.
Thank you, Peter, for the intro to Science Institute. So I'm Bin Yu from here, Berkeley Statistics and ECS. Has been really fun to work with Zach Lipton, my co-chair. Also get help from Shai to do this workshop. This is the beginning of the cluster on interpretable machine learning, and the design thoughts was really try to ground this cluster in the subject fields from physical science, biological sciences, and also in philosophy, causality, and also law. Interpretable machine learning or interpretability really sits in as a bridge between AI, machine learning, and also humans, right? So on one hand, you have interpretable, authentic interpretation from physical science models, we can really help advance sciences. On the other side, we also need to build trust into AI and interpretation also at the center. Recently, I think EU just had a new law going to put in place 2023 called Data Service Act. And there is about all service organizations, and they explicitly now ask the parameters when something content is recommended to a user need to be meaningful. So we can see that more things will come, and I hope we'll ground ourselves at the end of the workshop. We'll have better understanding of the different fields, and also have some synthesized principles and things we can work on during the whole month. I'll give the mic to my co-chair. Zach will also chair the first session.
Hey, thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for taking a radical step of showing up in person. I guess it's like a general framing. I mean, this is maybe my perspective. I don't want to speak for anyone else's opinions, but there's I just, like, in the context of a class, went back and reread Leo Breiman's sort of Two Worlds paper, and there's, I think, like a reasonable perspective that there's a world of like a universe of like a set of practices of modeling the world that is sort of theory driven, and you have a set of commitments about what you're modeling and what everything means and roughly what sort of relations exist between them, and you design a model, and it's sort of clear what the interpretation is. Of course, philosophers will still debate what do we mean by an interpretation, but there's something comparatively clear about what the interpretation is of the model that's sort of given force by the set of beliefs, the theory that sort of drove the model. And in some sense, like a lot of the modern practice of machine learning emerged from sort of, to some degree, being willing to forsake that for the sake of, achieving some objectives, predictive objectives, things like this. And now we find ourselves in a world where we have good predictive models and often sort of want to have our cake and eat it. And I think we're in a strange space where now we're not sort of in a practice of even thinking about what is an interpretation. What is even the object that we're interpreting? Are we modeling the natural world? Are we trying to say something about the model? It sort of slips around even within a paper. And I think we're in a weird stage where sort of, like the status quo, and it's not what any one individual is doing or what everyone's doing, but very often it's for people to sort of say, I did some stuff, I added a layer, I generated a picture, this is my interpretation, and or just make a sort of broad kind of sort of wild claim. And to some extent, I guess one of the hopes of this workshop is to just sort of ground ourselves again and to sort of, think like, what the hell are we even talking about? What are the actual problems we're trying to solve? And instead of doing that by sort of looking inwards, and I think there's a bit of a tendency we have in ML to invite the same people to speak at, every single event, and we see the talk and we know the talk and we know the slides and we recognize them, to really spend the workshop looking outwards. And so bring in people from philosophy, from economics, from the life sciences, from natural science, from physics, from economics, from various like social scientific contexts, and from a lot of places where people closer maybe to the action of something of what are we hoping to achieve by an interpretation, or at least bring an outside perspective. So I'm really excited. I think we're really fortunate to have a bunch of speakers who have sort of braved the perils of the apocalypse to come join us here. And yeah, looking forward to the workshop. Our first speaker today is David Danks. I guess I know David reasonably well, so I can give maybe like a slightly more personal introduction. You can look up all of his achievements. I think you asked maybe a lot of philosophers about the CMU. So he's now a professor at UCSD. I knew him as the head of philosophy at CMU when I joined, and I asked maybe some philosophers about the CMU philosophy department. Some of it is great. Some say it's weird. And say, how is it weird? And they do all kinds of weird things, like they hang out with computer scientists and they show up at machine learning conferences, and they're not so doctrinaire about where papers are published. And so, in some ways, I've been a beneficiary of the weirdness of people like, David, who are willing to come and cross these bridges and be the glue between disciplines. So Dave's got a kind of large oeuvre of work, but has, among other things, worked a lot related to philosophical aspects of cognitive science and neuroscience, causality and causal discovery, and also some of the moral and political questions related to artificial intelligence. So it's a great honor to have him here, and thanks, Dave, for joining us.
Nobody claps on Zoom. That's so, it's like, oh, wait, why are people clapping? Thanks, Zach and Bin and Shai, for the invitation to come up the coast. It is, this is the second in-person thing I've attended in 3 years, I think, so, or 2.5. So it's a little bit strange, so bear with me. So I wanted to talk about a topic having to do with sort of interpretability and neuroscience, but I want to just right off the bat say the in neuroscience part kept getting smaller as I was working on setting up the talk. So I am going to do some stuff on neuroscience, but that's not actually going to be the main focus of what I'm going to be talking about for most of the 30 minutes that I have here. Or Zach, am I supposed to leave Q&A? Sorry, I should have remembered this. I apologize.
The 30 minutes include the Q&A.
Okay, great. I will make sure to leave time for some Q&A. But there is a whole panel. Okay, great. Okay.
25 to 30.
We'll see. We've got a very nice schedule, I will say, to have actually time to talk.
Just have a 30-minute break right after you. So
okay,
go for it.
Sounds good. All right. So, as both Zach and Ben were saying, there's an enormous amount of work that's been going into interpretability, explainability, intelligibility, understandability, all of these biddies that people look for in the kinds of models and systems that we build using ML techniques. Okay, and I think what's striking is that the vast majority of it has focused on interpretable models, and I'm sure that we're going to be hearing a lot about interpretable models over the course of the next few days. In particular, people will in various ways restrict or bias their search spaces to only be a subset of the possible models. So the kind of classic, oh, I'm going to only consider linear models or additive models, or additive with smooth transitions, or whatever it may be. And so maybe people it'll only be a bias. You allow for a more complex model or one that seems to not make very much sense, if that's the only way to get good predictive power, right? So it isn't necessarily a hard restriction in terms of the search space, but that's one standard way of trying to generate interpretable models, to try and understand the pieces that fit together, and how they fit together in a sensible way, whatever that exactly is supposed to mean. The other, I think, main way that people have focused on trying to do interpretable models is building what I've called here, sorry for the somewhat vaguely philosophical jargony stuff, but these are, you give me a horribly complicated model that I can't make any sense of, and I look for sort of local approximations, things that are as if this is how the model works, right? So, the classic one here would be something like Lime, where you just are looking for the sort of local, roughly linear model that's right around whatever the decision point is. So you're getting this sort of facade of what's really going on, right? And you might say, well, that's, that can't possibly count as interpretability. Let me just sort of put my cards on the table and say, sure, it can. I can use Newtonian mechanics to understand how things move through space, even though that's not technically how physics works, right? We use approximations all the time in our attempts to understand the world around us. And, so personally, I have no problem calling those interpretable, though I can imagine there are some people here who might object to it. But I want to focus on something different, which is the vast majority of this work starts with the assumption that we actually have variables that mean something, that are the right kinds of things to be looking at in the first place. And I want to push back on that and say, well, a lot of times, and I'll give some examples on the next slide, a lot of times, actually, we don't have variables that make sense. What we're measuring, we don't think are plausibly the things that our models ought to be built out of. And I think this is roughly the thing when people want to understand not how a deep net works, say in a local post hoc way, but rather when they say, well, what are the intermediate layers all about? Right? The hope is that there might be something in there that is interpretable, which is to say a set of variables at those intermediate layers that make sense. And so that is related to some of the things I'm going to talk about, but I'm not going to be talking about deep nets. And I want to point out that this is actually, at least in the worlds that I operate in, a pretty common thing, that what we measure are not the variables we think we ought to be messing around with. They're the ones that make sense in terms of our theories. One example of this is if we think about climate science. So there's a lot of that happens down at UC San Diego with Scripps. And climate scientists don't operate at the level of a random buoy floating in the ocean in the North Pacific. Like, those are not the variables out of which they're building their models. They're building things out of, say, El Nino Southern Oscillation, or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or all of these ocean indices that capture the behavior of large parts of the ocean, either the sea surface temperature or the pressure readings around it. But of course, that's not what we measure. We don't measure El Nino. That's what you see. You see these nice plots of a univariate thing that changes over time. We don't measure El Nino. That's actually an aggregate of over 100 measurements. Okay. Educational psychology. So many of us in this room or online teach, and we want to know things like, when do my students actually learn something? And they surely don't learn anything from any particular sentence I utter. That is not the transformative thing that suddenly leads them to have a full, deep understanding, or that leads them to get an A in the class, right? The performance on one particular question in an exam is not the reason that a student gets an A. It's not even very predictive of what grade the student will get unless you have incredibly high stakes exams. And yet, that's what we measure. I can generate, Canvas is great for this. I can generate this huge spreadsheet of how students did on every single little question. But that's not the thing that measures understanding. Or the thing that I was going to sort of talk about the most today when I'm talking about an example, which is neuroimaging. So this is That's a shot of DTI, diffusion tensor imaging. This is a standard fMRI, right? Every couple of seconds, we're getting a snapshot of the blood flow within the brain. And in neuroimaging, the colors here are all added after the fact. Nobody thinks that this random voxel that's measured by fMRI is actually the thing that we should build our theories about. Now, people in neuroscience and neuroimaging often talk about we should build our theories based on regions of interest. Well, what on earth is a region of interest? It's supposed to be a part of the brain that operates relatively coherently. But what that means, we don't really have any idea. So what all of these, and I could have given a lot more examples of sciences in which what we measure is not what we think our theories should be built from. So we have to do some work. We have to, if we want to have interpretable variables, we're going to have to construct or discover them, depending on how active you think the role of the human is in all of this. So what does this look like? Well, there's actually a lot of different methods that people use. I bin them into these sort of 4 large-scale groups. This is the way I tend to think about it. So the first is that you basically cluster. So I've got a bunch of variables, and I look for high positive intercorrelations between those variables, especially over time, more generally across units. Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, say in the brain case, if I've got fMRI measurements, I'm going to say, well, where are the parts of the brain that light up, which is to say, with an appropriate time delay, show increased blood flow? Which parts of the brain light up together? Let's call those a region, because they're all doing the same thing, right? And obviously, when I say it that way, it's obvious that this is a bad inference, but nonetheless, it's a pretty standard practice. The same sort of thing happens sometimes in cases like climate science, where we look at which parts of the sea surface, for example, tend to change roughly together. A different strategy is to do clustering at the level of the dynamics. So we see a lot of this, for example, in EEG measurements, where you're looking at electrical signals on the surface of the scalp. And what we're doing there is often we're looking for sort of what I call here shared motifs, right? So dynamic signals that show up similarly, perhaps with a time delay to account for transmission distances between the brain and the surface of the skull. Right? But it's still a clustering. It's just now we're doing clustering based on some higher order feature. A third is that we look for things that have a high correlation with the target. Some target, you pick the target. So El Nino was originally defined as the sea surface temperature readings that were highly correlated with the strength of the monsoon season in India. If you look back in the late 19th, early 20th century, that's where that ocean index gets defined. If you look at a lot of work, the early work in neuroscience, trying to understand, for example, what happens in primary visual cortex, it was principally saying, well, which things are highly correlated with some target, namely, in this case, say, the occurrence of some visual stimulus out in the environment. Okay, so this is essentially a kind of variable construction based on a supervised thing. We've got some target, and we want to say what happens to be correlated with it. Well, that must be a detector or indicator or something having to do with that supervision. And then the fourth group is finding things that work in a model. And I'm guessing we're going to hear at least some of this perhaps this afternoon in the session on causality. But I think causal feature learning is kind of the epitome of this, the idea that I'm going to construct variables where the criterion that I'm going to use is essentially their suitability to provide a stable, over time or across individuals, causal model. So we've got these four different kinds of classes of methods. There are going to be ones that don't exactly fit or are hybrids, but early on a Tuesday, I'm not going to bother with trying to get to those details. Right? This is a high-level way of thinking about it. Now, what I really want to emphasize about these four different classes of methods, though, is that you can actually understand all of these, each of these, as simply different loss functions. And that's really all of these can be represented as optimization, but over very different kinds of loss functions. And loss functions are fundamentally, and here I mean this not in the mathematical sense, but in the philosophical sense, are about values. They're about what matters. So putting on, as Zach mentioned, I do a lot with ethics and policy of AI. Putting on that hat, I would just make the observation that anytime somebody says, I just do machine learning, I don't do ethics, my response is, sure you do. Why did you pick this loss function rather than that one? Every time you pick a loss function, you are doing ethics. You may not have known you were an ethicist. Congratulations. But you're doing ethics because you're saying this is what matters. This is the kind of performance that's relevant. This is the thing that is important in the world. And that's all values are. People talk in ethics about values. What they mean is values are what matters. And so when you pick a loss function, when you pick a criterion by which you're going to construct your variables, you are bringing to bear your values. Now, which values are going to depend on what your goals are? What are you trying to achieve with the particular thing that you're constructing? Okay, so which one of these kinds of methods we use is going to depend on why I'm doing this variable construction in the first place. Okay, there is no privileged one that is always the right way to do it. It's going to depend on what I'm trying to do. Okay. Now, okay, sure. If I'm doing science, I have to pay attention to why I care about this question, and then that shapes the method I use. This probably seems really banal. So here's the kind of kicker. I'm going to assert this as a claim. I'm not going to give you the theorems because, again, 9:45 on a Tuesday. I know I'm in Simon's Institute, but I didn't want to give people theorems and proofs. But I'm just going to assert that claim, which is that which of those methods you use can lead to different best variables, even in the large sample limit. We're not talking here about, oh, well, in finite data, sure, one will be better, one will be the other. And the sense of different here is a very strong sense of different. They are, in a deep sense, essentially incommensurable unless you go all the way down to the measured variables themselves. Now, of course, the different constructions are defined on the same measured variables. But that's like saying, you can understand everything as just, quantum particles or whatever, quantum wave functions or whatever. I don't do philosophy of physics, so I don't know what it's supposed to be, right? That's not interesting, right? We do think there's a difference between a human and a computer. And even though we're all just, quantum wave functions at the bottom. So there is a reason to carve off, human as distinct from. And so the way to think about this is that if you're doing different methods, sometimes actually you would say that the relevant variable is human plus computer. Actually, sometimes it'd be my left arm and the screen. That's the sense of sort of strong incommensurability, that these are not, it's not like there's a subset and it's like, oh, the causal ones, and then there's everything else or something like this. They are not translatable into each other without loss of information unless you go all the way back down to the measured variables. So what that means is that this technical result, when combined with the previous slide, means that which variables we construct are going to depend on our goals. And so therefore, our interpretable machine learning depends on our goals. Like what variables we use, which variables are the best ones for us to use to try to understand the world is going to depend on what we're trying to do with that. So it's not just that, the models are going to depend on our goals because we want to do a predictive model versus a causal model. This is what variables we even use within those models will depend on what we're trying to achieve. And in this sort of strong way that it isn't that there's a beyond the super fine grained of the measured, there's no way to intertranslate between. So it's not like we've got a hierarchy of models or hierarchy of variables here. So what does that mean, for example, in neuroscience? Well, the reality is that if you do neuroimaging, most of the raw measurements that you get are not interpretable in the usual senses of you can make sense of them. They're about other kinds of things, whether patches, volumes of brain activity, or sort of strange aggregations and interactions of different brain regions manifesting as surface measurements. And so we do have to construct variables. And unsurprisingly, within neuroscience, there's been a lot of methods that do this. So there's clustering methods that are about high local intercorrelation. There are ones that are about high predictive power. So MVPA, multivariate predictive analysis. So MVPA basically says, what are the parts of the brain that are really good for predicting something? There's now a number of people who are working on constructing variables to get causal dynamics, whether static causal dynamics, or that is to say sort of snapshot IID samples, or the causal dynamics over time. And notably, different variable sets are constructed depending on which of these methods we use. These kinds of incommensurable variable sets are constructed depending on what we use. So if I'm trying to build a causal model of the brain, I will parcellate essentially the brain differently than if I'm trying to predict behavior. And not in a subsettable kind of way. Again, it's not a hierarchical thing. It's this part of the brain gets lumped in with this object for my theory if it's a causal model, and it gets lumped in with a completely different one if I'm trying to build a predictive model. So what this means is it means that we have a sort of, there's a lurking risk, right? So you might be thinking, yeah, okay, goals matter in science, so what? The lurking risk is about a sort of problematic, what in philosophy of science we would call pluralism about science, which is I'm trying to build my causal model, Zach's trying to build his predictive model, and we each build models that are interpretable within those goals, and those models are incommensurable. They cannot be put together and unified into a single model unless we go all the way down to sort of the level of a neuron. And we don't know how to think about the brain as a collection of individual neurons. That is unlikely to be an interpretable, understandable model if we're having to go down to that level. Okay, so that's the risk here, is actually a very practical one, which is a kind of potential fracturing of science based on what the goals are. Not about, I mean, of course there's a fracturing, the neuroscientists don't always talk to the economists, but we're saying within a science, within people who study the hippocampus, you can get this kind of fraction. So it's something that we need to acknowledge. And I don't have great answers about what to do. This is, I apologize, a bit of a negative talk in the sense of, here's this issue that we need to at least acknowledge. And what are needed are either better methods or ways that we have systems that we can easily tune what criteria we look at or balance criteria, and ways of representing the choices that are made in the construction of variables as a kind of metadata at the very least. So I mean, I think there are broader implications that we get, as I was saying, this kind of incommensurable interpretability, depending on what it is that I'm trying to do. My model is not translatable into somebody else's model of the same thing. And so we need to think not just, there's been this big push in the XAI and interpretable AI community to think about, well, interpretable for whom? Like, that the explainable, sorry, I'll use that term, explainable model, if I'm doing loan approvals, might be different if I'm the loan officer versus the explanation that I as a loan applicant would want. That, I think, there's getting a lot of traction and people are talking about that. That's the for whom. And I think really it's about the why. In fact, I'll make the contentious claim and then just move on blithely, that it's actually not about for whom at all. When we say for whom, what we really mean is why. That it's all about the goals and the functions. It's not about who we're getting. It's just that particular people are stereotypically in particular roles with corresponding goals. And in particular, what I want to emphasize, if we think about sort of more broadly, scientifically, societally, this is where we keep finding in our work, this is where the most of the theorems have been showing, we can get pretty big differences in terms of the variables that are constructed based on whether we're doing predictive models or causal models. And that suggests that we might have to have we have a sort of potential concern, which is how do we figure out which one is more societally important in some sense in a context? So if I'm building a neuroscientific model, say for treatment versus diagnosis, right? Diagnosis versus treatment, it's going to matter which kind of model I use. And so there's a lot of, I think, concerns about things like, say, some of the stuff that's happening at NIH to try and find grand unified theories of the brain, especially with regards to mental health and mental illness. All right, so with that, I think that this is maybe not the launch talk that that Zach and Ben and Shai wanted, but I think it's important right from the very beginning to not just focus on the models, but to think about the variables that go into those models, the things that are the sort of building blocks out of which we build our theories and understandings of the world, and which of those variables that we have to be interpretable intrinsically depends on what our goals are. This isn't well, we can find the best fitting set of, find the sort of the right variables. We can, to use the philosophical terms, carve nature at its joints, right? That's this classic philosophical idea that maybe what we can do is we can there's a natural way to carve up the world that works for causation and prediction and supervised clustering and all these things. And what we've shown, unfortunately, is that's wrong. In fact, there's not a single privileged way to carve nature at its joints. And so we've got this sort of fundamental tension based on what we're trying to achieve. And we are actually seeing this is the part I didn't go into in detail. I just sort of asserted there are these different methods that show up. But in fact, we've got examples of different papers where people are looking at ostensibly the same data and getting very different models, in part because they're getting very different variables based on what their goals are. So we actually are seeing this in modern neuroimaging practice, and we're trying to figure out what to do about it. So with that, I will just say thanks, and thanks to the collaborators and conversationalists, some of whom think I'm really, really wrong. So please blame me for these, not these folks. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Great. Okay, so I will just run around with a microphone. Is that okay? Cool.
Very interesting, and I really enjoyed it. Somehow it looks to me very related to the question of what is a good method for clustering, because what you call variables is some way of clustering the measurements or the measuring the raw variables. And I just want to mention that it's almost a copy I mean, of a talk that I have about clustering that says there are different goals, and with different goals, you're going to use different clustering methods. And you cannot have a universal clustering that is better than any other. And I wonder about what you think about this difference between telling this story in the context of clustering and telling this story in the context of interpretability.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Yes, I agree. And you can tell this about just clustering. One thing that I think is important is that, so when I first started thinking that way, I was thinking about the clustering, and the response I got from multiple people, including some on this slide right now, is, well, yeah, but if you look at, in particular, causal models, those are going to be the right variables. And so the problem with clustering is, well, you have small finite samples. If you just had infinite samples and you thought in terms of causation, then this all goes away. And so that's what led to the theoretical work of finding, yeah, no, it doesn't help at all. The problem actually just keeps getting worse. So I agree, within those four classes, there are certain kinds of incommensurability results even within each of those four groups. We were thinking about the even bigger thing of, is there maybe, again, this philosophical dream of carving nature at its joints? And no, even in the large sample limit, it's just an intrinsic problem to our limited epistemic capabilities.
And the same thing occurs in clustering, even in the infinite limit of samples.
Right. Yeah.
So great talk. So I was wondering, like, amongst the challenges you have listed, do any of them also subsume the requirement that the user can sometimes specify what kind of variables they are looking for? And I've seen this fairly frequently in industrial settings where people say that I want to understand your predictions in terms of a certain kind of persona or division of personas. Some clustering of variables of demographics, right? So I think that leaves room for people to be able to specify in some language what are sort of the meta patterns they're looking for. So if I were to translate to what you said, it's not just different losses, but losses with maybe different structural constraints around what you can discover.
Yeah, so at least some of those are actually going to be the kinds of structural constraints that distinguish these different kinds of things. So what is the model class? I mean, all of these, in some sense, what you do is you're looking at, to use the language of clustering, you're looking at which way of clustering or parcellating the things that I've got will lead to a good model. Now, it might be a sort of simplistic, almost identity kind of model. It might be a complicated causal model, but they all fit into that. And so you can certainly restrict in various ways. And it is the case that I want to emphasize, the can here is an important term. It's deliberately not always, because it might be that in some cases, if you restrict things in the right way, there actually is a single best cluster, single best set of variables for all of the different goals, okay? This is not an impossibility theorem in the sense that necessarily there's going to be a conflict. Now, empirically, we seem to see it a lot, but it isn't that. So an interesting question, I think, is whether the kinds of things you're talking about within a particular domain, right? Because in neuroscience, you're not going to care about demographic variables in the same way you might on a social scientific data set. Is it the case that under the kind of natural restrictions that people impose in a domain, that actually these theorems fail, right? Because that would be an interesting thing. It might be that within a domain that there's a kind of, well, no, these are the things we care about, and that simplifies it in such a way that we do always get a single best set of variables. I don't know anyone who's got any results on that. I think it's an interesting question that we should be asking, though. Yeah.
Oh, hi. You stressed the loss function and that driving things. Can you elaborate on how do you pick the loss function based on like the results that you anticipate, or based on what's known, or is it more so like a discovery thing? Like you start with a loss function that in your experience you've started with loss function that seems to be sensible, and then make statements about it, and that's the first part. And the second part is like a multi-objective loss function. Have people considered that? I know this is pretty loaded, but across like different neuroscience modalities, and as far as making interpretations, yeah. So I mean, in general, what people do is they use the loss function that people use in their lab, or that you find in the random papers. I mean, so unfortunately, a lot of times the loss function is not chosen intentionally or with real thought about what the right one is. The right way to do it, I would argue, is figure out what you're going to try and do, what kinds of variables you care about, and use that to then figure out what the values are, and so therefore what loss function. So a kind of intentionality about the choice is a good thing. It does not always happen in practice. Now, to your second question about multi-term loss functions. So I actually have a kind of contrary view to a lot of people, which is I think for variable construction, that's usually not a smart thing to do. Because what you get is you get variables that you don't know how to interpret, because they're kind of the predictive ones and kind of the causal ones, but they're not really either one. And so it's actually hard semantically to make sense of the things that result from that. So for variable construction, I tend to be, I mean, you can do it. Obviously, you know, any of these, you know, take any two loss functions, you can always just do a weighted average of the two. So you can, I tend, in my experience in neuroimaging and in the social areas of social science, particularly public health kinds of things, I don't find this actually being that useful to do multi-objective loss functions. For the variables, for the models, yes. But that's because there, what we're trying to capture is the actual trade-offs that societally are important. For example, about, you know, false positive, false negative rates and those kinds of things.
Cool. So how about we'll take one more and then we'll enjoy our extended coffee break. And I encourage everyone to corner Dave in. I think at least on the official schedule, they absorbed the coffee break in after and then had Sina and then panel, but I'm happy to go either way. We had a speaker cancel, so we have an extra half hour to annoy David and Sina.
There is a break in the current draft.
Right. The question is just whether to do the break between the talks, but not between Sina's talk and the panel, or do it talk, break, panel.
Right. We could nosh on our break, gradually. Anyway,
one more question.
sometime between now and 10 minutes from now, we'll decide. But
okay.
In the meanwhile, we have what Joe promises me will be a longish question.
Uh-oh.
Well, longish comment or something. So first, let me say that in our notion of causal model that I've been pushing, the choice of variables is very much up to the modeler. So I'm totally comfortable with that picture, and it's a hard choice. One thing that might be relevant here is I did some work with my former postdoc Sander Beckers and an update with Sander and Frederick Eberhardt, where we were talking about the notion of abstraction. So what does it mean that a high-level model captures a lower-level model, where I think of the lower-level model as the pixels or the details of the ocean current, the high-level model is the language you really want to talk about. And, so we had definitions that sort of talked about causality works the same way. Whatever you do at the high level, there's a corresponding thing at the low level. I won't go into details of the definition. So you can make sense out of the fact that all the models that you're looking at are compatible with the low-level model as far as causality goes. Yes. They're just talking about different things. And again, I'm totally comfortable with that, but at least in principle, it would seem to me that there's like a lattice of models where you have two models here, that they're incommensurate because they talk about totally different things, but you can imagine a model that, so to speak, lies above both in some sense. And maybe is closer to the really low level model, maybe below both. I don't know. That whose variables are the union of the variables in some sense, and that you ought to be able to make sense out of that. Is there any intrinsic reason you can't?
Yeah. So first I would say I really like the abstraction work with Sander and Frederick, and it's cited in the draft paper that sits behind this. So
I wasn't trying to get a piece.
no, but I think that's exactly right. And yes, so it is. You can think about it as a lattice,
right?
Give me two higher level models. I can do intersection. I can do union with the variables,
right?
And either way, I'm moving around in it. That's all very well defined. And in our at least practical experience, when you go to the intersect or join,
right?
First of all, you are taking a hit in terms of the performance relative to whatever the loss function is that led to these being picked as the optimum.
Right.
The variables also become less interpretable. Just in practice, when we look at what the variables are, you can sort of look and go, well, yeah, but it's really kind of these two half variables, and you just kind of want to put them together. The problem is you want to put them together in different ways, depending on what you're trying to do.
I would have thought.
So computation, let me just quickly say, so this is just an empirical claim, which is, computationally, it's all perfectly well defined. Cognitively, there seems to be a real cost.
Right. So I suspect you're right, but in some sense, so in other words, you're looking at the world your way with your variables. I'm looking at the world my way with my variables. Now we're trying to construct a model that, so to speak, combines the variables. Well, then we have to start talking to each other and so to speak, explaining your weird way of looking at the world from my perspective in terms of things that I can understand and vice versa. So I can imagine quite easily that would be cognitively difficult because I don't get your way of looking at the world, right? And vice versa, right? So there's work involved, right? So that, but that might actually, if we're talking about humans, and that might actually be useful work in terms of, it's forcing me to understand how your perceptions of the world map to mine, right? That's exactly what's the mathematics of what's going on is exactly that.
Yeah. How do we find that intersect model in the lattice so that we can actually map between.
It's not necessarily, understanding that and forcing people to do it is not necessarily a bad thing. But.
Yeah, I will say it stands in contrast to what I think a lot of people assume, which is that it's a kind of classic reductionist picture, which is
So
everyone gets subsumed into
and
a.
I agree that it's not that.
Yeah.
I definitely.
Then that's the part that I really am most concerned about it in a lot of ways. So, yeah, great.
Great, thanks everyone. Okay, so maybe how's this plan? Why don't we take something on the order like 15 now, and that'll preserve like 5 minutes of our surplus break time for like a potty break after the second talk and before the panel or something like that. Good. All right, yellow. Let's go.